Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session. We're talking about ammonia, sources, impacts and solutions and funding initiatives. And we were originally going to run this session back in March, some of you may recall, last year, but unfortunately we were thwarted by COVID, and we've wanted to run this since. We were hoping that we would come out of lockdown and optimistically hoped everything would get better, but we've had to resort to a webinar. And the other reason for the delay is because we've had problems with COVID within the department in terms of resources. So some of us have been temporarily redeployed. But anyway, today what we are going to do is, let me just move on. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Colette Garner, and I work in the National Catchment Sensitive Farming team as an air quality advisor. So today we will be joined by a couple of members of the Eden Rivers Trust, who are one of our delivery partners here in the Northwest, and also some of my colleagues from Catchment Sensitive Farming. So just some basic housekeeping rules. You'll just make sure that your microphone is muted. I think we've muted everybody and that your camera is turned off. And what we'd like to do with the questions is encourage you to use the chat facility. So just so that we can keep the presentation running smoothly, because there's quite a lot of slides and presenters. We would like you to use the chat facility, and then at the end we'll open the floor up for questions. And what we'll also do is we'll make a note of the questions and the ones off chat as well, and compile a list of questions and answers, and we will circulate them after the event. So you can open the chat by moving your cursor to the bottom half of your screen, and it's that little chat icon. So a little bit about Catchment Sensitive Farming. We're a partnership between Defra, the Environment Agency, and Natural England, and we work together with farmers and organisations in priority areas across England to improve the quality of water and air. And as I just said, Eden Rivers Trust is an environmental charity that's focused on protecting the River Eden and its tributaries in Cumbria, and they work with a wide range of partners, including ourselves and Natural England and local community groups, to deliver that sustainable integrated approach to managing the rivers and the land. So why are we running this workshop? Well, basically, all of the people that are attending this work with farmers on a daily basis, as do Catchment Sensitive Farming. And, you know, we're trying to raise the level of awareness amongst the farming community about about ammonia, where it comes from, and, what we can do to reduce the impacts on designated sites. So the idea of this workshop is to raise everybody to the same level and, facilitate that consistent messaging, build the capacity for ammonia advice delivery on farms, so we've got more people that are able to go out there and advise farmers, and enable advisors to undertake the scale assessments that are becoming a requirement now of planning applications for farmers. So we've split the workshops into two halves. The first one today is informational. So we're talking about why ammonia is an issue and what the government is doing about it. What are the drivers for change? Where does it come from on the farm? How is it formed? What the impacts are on the environment and human health, and what some of the mitigation solutions are, and how there are funding initiatives available for farmers to take advantage of. The next one is going to be on Monday, and that's going to focus more on the planning system and the use of impact risk zones, APIS and scale to be able to undertake scale screening assessments. So we'd love you to join us for that one as well. So I'll hand over to Rosie now.
Hello.
Okay, Rosie.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the national context of why ammonia sort of come up the agenda. So this graph is showing some of the major air pollutants that basically it starts off with everything in 1970 being 100, so it's a reference point to 1970. I'm showing how most air pollutants have decreased over time, apart from ammonia, which has sort of stayed at a fairly level place, which is why it's sort of come up the national agenda as to the pollutant that's now the one that's the focus. There was a bit of a decrease in ammonia emissions in the early 2000s, and then there was a little bit of an uptick kind of 2013, and a lot of that has been put down to the use of urea-based fertilisers and possibly some digestate. We have seen the figures for the past 5 years, and to be honest, it hasn't really changed much. So there's been lots of initiatives to reduce other air pollutants, and now there are initiatives to reduce ammonia as a sort of next pollutant that the government is working on. And this was sort of highlighted in the Clean Air Strategy that was launched in 2019. Now, Defra is undertaking sort of consultations and looking at new rules to try and reduce ammonia. And they've sort of just agreed that a 16% reduction in ammonia by 2030 was a realistic target based upon kind of current systems and the capacity within the agricultural industry to do that. The ways that Defra are looking to reduce ammonia include looking at urea-based fertiliser, and there is actually a consultation that's out at the moment that closes at the end of this month. So if anyone is interested in putting in a response to that, please do. Defra's preference is for a complete ban on urea-based fertiliser. The other two options in that consultation are timed applications or use with an inhibitor. Now, is there someone who's not on mute? Would people just be able to check that they're on mute? Thank you. Now, Defra's preference is for a complete ban. I think a lot of that is because it will get the best results, and also it's one of the easiest things to regulate. The next thing in the Clean Air Strategy was that solid manures would need incorporating within 12 hours of application. Now, we don't really have any further detail on this yet. I'm personally not quite sure how that applies to permanent pasture, but I'm sure we will get more detail as time goes on, and that's actually launched. Now, a couple of the really big things are low emission spreading by 2025, which is essentially saying that splash plates are going to be banned. Now, most farmers seem to be quite aware of this and are looking at how they can mitigate and look at investments. There have been some funding available through countryside productivity grants, and we think this is going to carry on under the Farming Investment Fund. So that's probably going to come around quite quickly, but I think most people are aware of it now. Covering slurry and digestate stores by 2027. I think this one is causing slightly more concern in the agricultural industry, just because it can be quite expensive and complicated depending on the type of slurry store you've got. Existing stores the covers can be funded via countryside stewardship, but obviously that's only if the slurry store is compliant and suitable for a cover. There is talk of a slurry investment scheme from 2022, and there's quite a lot of consultation underway to look at what is actually required in that. We still don't know the full details yet, and sort of waiting to hear what that will be. Then the other things are design standards for livestock housing. Again, we're not quite sure how this will be implemented. I think it will definitely be something to do with any new housing. Whether there are requirements with existing housing or not, we're not quite sure yet. But we think that will be linked in with the final point in this, which is that there's going to be an extension of permitting, which already exists in pig and poultry. That's going to be extended to dairy and intensive beef. There are some working groups looking at this, and I'm going to pass on to Andy in a minute, who is on one of those subgroups, who's going to be able to tell us a little bit more about how that's progressing. And then planning requirements. So anyone who puts in a planning application to a local authority, the local authorities have to check with Natural England to make sure that that application won't have any significant effect on a designated site. Every designated site has impact risk zones around it, and if that planning application triggers one of those risk zones, then a planning application requires what's called a scale screening assessment with it. Now, we're going to go into lots of detail about what scale actually is in the second one of these presentations, but just to say that any planning application probably will need that if it's near a designated site. If Natural England get a planning application through to their consultation hub that doesn't have that scale assessment, they then return it to the local planning authority, who return it to the applicant, and you essentially have to start again. So what we're trying to encourage is that when farmers are putting in planning applications, they're considering ammonia, and they're making sure that that scale assessment goes in at the initial stages. Obviously, we're quite happy in catchment sensitive farming to discuss that with farmers and talk about what mitigation measures would sort of improve that scale assessment and get that planning through. Now, a little word of warning that assessments are likely to follow the example that Wales has already gone down and become much more restrictive. Now, designated sites and habitat regulation assessments haven't changed since Brexit, so all of those designated sites have been enshrined in UK law, so there won't be any changes in terms of those impact risk zones. But we're going to go into much more about planning in part 2 of this. Now I'm going to pass over to Andy, who can talk a bit more about environmental permitting. Okay, hopefully the little ball's coming over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, right. Yeah, so my name's Andy Dyer. I work for Eden Rivers Trust and as a Senior Farming Conservation Officer. I was invited to join the Dairy and Intensive Beef Technical Working Group back in October 2019. This is a very large group of individuals and stakeholders consisting, as I say on the list there, UK regulators, and technical experts, including experts from Northern Ireland, where they are probably a year or two ahead of where we are in England at the moment in terms of the ramping up of the regulations. And there are farmer representatives on the board as well, and then representatives, I say, of the dairy and beef sectors. Other people have been pulled in over the first initial 2 or 3 months of that technical working group being set up, including equipment suppliers, because there was a realization quite clearly that there was no point in bringing in additional rules and regulations that required, covering over of stores or redesign of stores if then the equipment manufacturers and suppliers weren't up to speed as to what was coming. And organisations such as Eden Rivers Trust, other NGOs are also represented on that technical working group. The fundamental aim when it was set up back in 2019 was to allow information exchange either on a technological basis, economic, environmental or regulatory matters to be shared within a much wider audience. And then the plan then was to effectively take that forward to producing these best available techniques. So very early on, the working group was split into a number of subgroups, and I sit on 2 or 3 of those. The main focus in the last little while has been on nutrition, but that's not to say that there's not other work going on elsewhere. This group was set up really in terms of its terms of reference to identify best practice, conduct those reviews, analyse research and development out there, consult with the wider audience where that was applicable, and to then identify knowledge gaps. And the whole purpose of this is to support EA and therefore Defra to produce this fit for purpose techniques guidance, which, as Rosie was saying, we aim to be able to start putting that into process later on this year. This is all obviously part of the Defra Clean Air Strategy 19, and moving forward as Emma, who will be talking later on, she'll fill in the gaps as to the more technical side of things that's being discussed within this wider committee in terms of potential mitigation of all these factors. So I'll just pass on now next to Susan.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thanks very much for dialing in. My name is Susan Kenworthy, and I'm a Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer on the River Eden. So I've got a really nice bit of the presentation to talk about this morning, which is why ammonia is a problem and how it becomes a problem. So I'm going to talk about from what you might remember from your kind of GCSE or O-level biology is that ammonia is formed when urea and urine comes into contact with ureas in the faeces. So urease is an enzyme, and it hydrolyzes urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide. So as you can maybe remember from all that science all those years ago, was that enzymes don't break down in that process; they just keep going. So that's kind of why this, it's really important. It's how it happens, but it's also why the process kind of keeps on happening. Why it's really important to kind of separate all those products. So ammonia is formed really quickly within that timescale for urine and faeces coming into contact with one another, and there's also other nitrogen compounds that you would find in manures and slurries, which are also gradually broken down by bacteria, that also then kind of add to that ammonia production process. And this is kind of during storage, this is during kind of spreading, this is during times where animals are kind of mixing inside and outside, and it's also when you kind of actually use that slurry outside. So the majority of ammonia is produced whilst these products are being stored and being spread, and losses occur when material comes into contact with air, particularly when it's warm and windy. So a lot of you might have seen the figures about the kind of losses when ammonia is spread, and it's very variable, and it's not because there's kind of doubt or variation in the data. It's because it's so variable when it's actually being spread. So on particularly warm and windy days, the volatilization process happens really quickly, and on calm, still, cold days is when the process is a little bit slower. Like I say, those enzymes just kind of keep on going. So we're talking about sort of nitrogen or ammonia being lost. That's a loss of a product that is useful to the farm as well. So whilst it's being lost to the atmosphere and whilst it's being lost to the environment, it's a less effective fertiliser and it loses financial value as well. So it's really important for those reasons that we seek to reduce those losses, both for the environment and for health reasons and for farm financial reasons as well. So we know that we can also effectively combine or kind of seek to make those benefits from reducing ammonia losses to reduce the amount of manufactured fertiliser that is used as well, but also has an ammonia cost to it. So really, in terms of this first slide, really the sort of key mitigation measures are around keeping urine and faeces separate so that we don't produce as much ammonia, so that they don't come into contact with each other. That we reduce the contaminated surface areas that are exposed to the air, and that we reduce or eliminate the airflow over the exposed areas. So in terms of that kind of thing, obviously we might want to talk about sort of separation and scraping whilst animals are being housed, and also some of the things that you might want to think about is improving slurry storage and slurry storage capacity so that farmers are not having to go out and spread on days where the weather is unsuitable for it, or that and manures and slurries are not exposed to the air as much. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So where does it come from? So we've kind of gone into that a little bit on the last slide, but really kind of looking at these two slides here, you can see that the vast majority of ammonia is produced from cattle and from cattle housing and manure applications. So we're kind of looking at this. We know that 87% of ammonia emissions in the UK come from agriculture. It's by far the biggest producer of ammonia. And in that, some of the sectors have obviously have taken measures to reduce that. We know that there's taken poultry permitting, and like Andy was saying before, we're kind of thinking now about cattle permitting as well, because we know that that's where the largest percentages of ammonia losses are from. So if we want to move on to the next slide, please. So I kind of part of what I'm going to talk about is some of the environmental factors, although I was going to go into that in a lot more detail later on. So it's just really to talk about, so why is this a problem? So the reason why it's an issue is both for public health reasons and also for environmental reasons as well. So we know that the sources are mainly from agriculture, but we also know that ammonia reacts in the atmosphere to produce particulate matter, which can have a huge impact on people with cardiovascular and respiratory issues and can cause those issues. So and also it can travel. It's not so much a local issue where it's concerned with human health. It travels a long way. So within the sort of prevailing weather that we've got in the UK, those sorts of the production of ammonia gas can react to produce particulate matter in urban areas that are actually further away from the local area that we're in. But we're also finding that ammonia deposition onto sort of protected sites, onto sensitive habitats, is also an issue as well, where it can reduce biodiversity. It's basically that product that you would have used on your farm to make your grass grow is over-fertilising areas where there should really be low nutrients. So this kind of results in acidification of soils and fresh waters, and it reduced, and then consequently causes reduced species diversity. So if we want to move on a little bit, please, onto the next slide. So we know that looking at the figures from 2017, we've got a lot of sensitive habitats in the UK, and those sensitive habitats are suffering from excess nitrogen deposition, and that is coming from ammonia. So some of these, I'm going to go into this a little bit more on the next slide, but some of these plants can cope with lower, indicator species, because of their sensitivity to deposition, in that they can cope with can only cope with very low levels, and some species can cope with a little bit more, but overall the effect is that it becomes over-fertilised. So, some of these figures here are really quite shocking when you kind of look at the percentages involved in this. Is that between 87 and 96% of sensitive designated sites in England receive ammonia concentration above the critical level for lichens and bryophytes. So we kind of look at that as a loss from those farms, but also a loss to the environment, and reducing our biodiversity. So if we move on to the next slide, please. We're just going to look at a couple of examples of really what I was talking about there. So when it's talking about your kind of lower plants, that's what it means by sort of bryophytes that can only really cope with very low sort of sensitivities to these types of atmospheric pollution or deposition. And this kind of thing that you would sort of notice when you were looking at it is that we get a lot of more kind of slime types of types of lichens and fungus growing on things, or what is more obvious, really, for those of us like myself who are not necessarily that experienced at looking at fungus and lichens and things, is that you can see the difference when you look at grasslands, where those grasslands and those plants are better adapted to low nutrient situations, and once those nutrients increase, it's a little bit like fertilising your fields from what used to be maybe like a hay meadow into a silage field. Is the exact same effect. So if we just have a look at the next slide, I mean, obviously Al's going to go into this quite a bit more. So I just kind of really wanted to look at the next bit is really around some local impacts and how important it is when you're talking to farmers about this type of thing, and what you might see and what is likely to happen when you're thinking about some of the work that people might want to do to mitigate against this, is to kind of think, well, certainly in Cumbria, the impact risk zone pretty much covers the whole county, because there are so many sensitive sites and habitats in Cumbria, 278 just in Cumbria alone. I know we're kind of talking about the northwest, but also thinking about how much deposition can carry as well. And obviously there's plenty of sensitive sites around the northwest that are not just in Cumbria. So I just kind of, I wanted to kind of think about all the places that we can see, all sorts of things that can happen. I've just got a little picture of Icot Hill there as a kind of local site, is kind of thinking about this affects us everywhere. This is, although you can't see it, it's much easier when we're talking to farmers about water pollution. It's something that's tangible, you can physically see it. Ammonia is a much harder thing to talk about, so we just have to assume that it's being lost, and it's being lost to the environment around us, and these impacts are going to affect habitats that we see, that we enjoy, that we are also part of, that we're part of managing. And if we just go on to the very next slide, please. It was just to kind of think about, this is, I'm obviously really not trying to single anybody out. I just want to take a picture of a very typical farm where this is something where, you're going to be losing ammonia from this site, as well as water pollution. There's also going to be air pollution arising from this. It's not just the things that are running downhill. There's a little beck at the bottom there, but there's also going to be very windy at that site. The cows are outside quite a lot of the time. There's a whole lot of, there's no separation there of kind of slurry and urine. There's no Shelterbelts or anything like that. There's no attempt to reduce the airflow in there. So when we kind of go into farms and looking at these really typical sorts of scenarios, as well as thinking about all the things that we talked about that have been really successful in CSF over the years about reducing water pollution, we're also now thinking about ammonia and losses to the air as well. And I just wanted to put in a sort of little picture of something that I quite liked, which is something that we found a few years ago on a tree. It's also really quite close to that site. It's called a slurry crust fungus. So it's one of those things, I never thought about these sorts of things at all, but once you see them, once you look at them, they're absolutely everywhere, and they're fascinating. And these are the sorts of things that are really affected or really impacted upon. So I was kind of thinking, can we identify that? Is that something that's come off the top of the slurry store, or is that something that's growing on the side of a tree? That is actually growing on the side of a tree. It's got nothing to do with slurry at all. It's just its rather unfortunate name. So hopefully that's kind of given you an idea of how ammonia is formed and released into the atmosphere, and the impacts that it has, and why it's really critical for improving public health and improving the biodiversity and sensitive sites. We know that for human health, I don't know if some of you might have read recently about a case where it was the first case in the UK where someone's tragic death of a child was directly attributed to air pollution. So we know when we're talking about how ammonia travels and how it interacts to cause particulate matter and increases that, and it affects people's cardiovascular and respiratory systems. We know that that's now directly having an impact on people. So, and that's obviously very kind of timely at the moment and pertinent at the moment when we're talking about the transmission of virus particles. Up until maybe this time last year, we never really thought that much about, we can transmit flu, but we've got cures for those sort of things, we've got vaccines for those sort of things, but now we've got a virus that, we're struggling to contain, and it has the potential to have been affected by the air pollution that we are seeing, that we are detecting. So looking at that, these sorts of things are really critical in terms of overall human health and public health. We know that there's a potential link between long-term exposure to air pollution and mortality and morbidity from coronavirus and some other types of respiratory airborne diseases. So in those sorts of things, it's really important that we do address this now with the farmers that we're working with. So if we could just move on, I think that might be everything that I wanted to talk about. So we can just move on to Al's section now, please.
Good morning. My name's Alistair Brock. I'm Head of Conservation with the Eden Rivers Trust, and I manage a small team of people working on conservation within the Eden Rivers Valley. I've also got a history, 15-year history of working with Natural England, working on restoration of peat bogs. And my section here is just a brief section, just looking at the impacts of nitrogenous air pollutants, including ammonia, on peat bogs. Just to put a bit of a context, there's evidence, increasing evidence that agricultural ammonia, certainly in this area, the region from West Cumbria and the Eden Valley, borne on prevailing winds, which are southwesterly, are being deposited on both lowland and upland peat bogs. And this leads to both vegetative changes and changes actually to the peat mass itself. Just very quickly to give you an idea of the range of peatlands that people come across. It's not just blanket bog, which we see up on the uplands, but that's possibly one of the areas that is most impacted. But we also have everything from intermediate bogs and lowland bogs down in below 200 metres, and then estuarine valley and basin mires. All of these can be impacted by nitrogenous products. Just a couple of quick pictures, and this leads on to the next slide. Nitrogen and the airborne pollutants are not the only things that impact on bogs, so it's important to get the context. The left-hand slide showing the Coalbeck Fells there, damage can be from a whole variety of things, and certainly on a lot of the fells in Cumbria, there's a huge amount of peat extraction that's taken place, a lot associated with past mining and things like that. So there are a variety of impacts and they overlap each other. But ammonia is certainly one of the most or increasingly common issues that we are finding on the damage of peat bogs. Just very quickly, characteristics of peat bogs, if you didn't know already, they're rain-fed, being rain-fed, slightly acidic the rainfall, and they're very nutrient poor. So there's not a lot of nutrients normally in rainfall. So a bog is adapted to be or the plants on our peat bog are adapted to survive in nutrient-poor, acidic, cold and waterlogged conditions. That really means that you have very few plant groups, and sphagnum, which is a type of moss, and the species there dominate, occasionally with a bit of heather and stunted trees sort of growing on little tussocks. As the sphagnum bases die, because it's waterlogged, cold and acidic, they don't rot, they just start forming layers and layers of peat. So in good conditions, without any adverse impacts, then a peat bog will start growing upwards, if you like. They say something like a millimetre a year over the last 10,000 years. Just to give you a very quick picture of a reasonably decent bog, and I say reasonably decent bog, pretty well every bog in Britain has been impacted by man's activities. But this is a reasonably good example. And the vegetation you see there this is from a lowland raised bog up on the Solway, but it's very typical of what you would also see on a blanket bog above 1,500 meters, 1,500 feet is what I meant to say. So sphagnum dominated, occasional tree and heather. The issues we find, and I'll go on to the pollutants in a minute, because it's not just pollutants we see, but burning, grazing, peat cutting, milling, and various drainage have all impacted on bogs. These all overlap, and the impact of these is it causes a loss of biodiversity. It also can lead to a loss of peat, and impacts also on water quality and flooding, because the water holding and slowing capacity of peat bogs in the uplands decreased. So what happens? Well, let's call it ammonia. it comes off from the agricultural ammonia comes off, and it goes into airborne and then lands either as wet deposition in rain or as cloud droplets, or sometimes as dry deposition on plants, and it increases with altitude. In its basic activity, nitrogen and sulfur compounds will increase cause acidification. So they make a peat bog, which is already very acidic, even more acidic. And there comes to a point where the plants that can survive in an acidic situation can no longer survive, and you can actually get full cover loss of sphagnum species from increasing of nitrogen and sulfur. To give you an idea, other things, it's a central plant nutrient, and as I say, North Scandinavia and Canada, which is not necessarily appropriate here, but they are good examples. A little bit of nitrogen actually helps sphagnum growth, but as you increase it, the capacity of the sphagnum, as it says here, to utilise pollutants, polluted nitrogen is exceeded, and once that happens, you start to see a die-off of the sphagnums, and you see a replacement of the sphagnum mosses with vascular plants such as grasses, heathers, and others. There's an additional knock-on effect of the vascular or the higher the vascular plants growing, in that they have rooting systems as opposed to the sphagnum mosses, so the rooting systems get into the peat. As they get into the peat, that starts opening the peat, allowing air in, oxygen in, and the peat starts rotting or basically decomposing. So you're not, and as it decomposes, it loses its ability to hold water. So nitrogen increases vascular plant competition. You get increasing decomposition of the peat, and it loses its water holding properties. So you ultimately get the peat forming species displaced. And as this again says here, the nitrogen can also increase the rate of decomposition at the bottom of the moss shoot, so you get thinner peat layers. And at very high exposures, example close to livestock units, gaseous ammonia can have a direct toxic effect and actually kill sphagnum and various other plants. This is very quick, and it's hard to actually find pictures which in the UK which show direct impact of ammonia on peat bogs. But the left-hand picture is it's a blanket bog in Cumbria, and it shows a sort of a typical a range of plants, sphagnum dominated, but with bits of Molinia, various other grasses, an occasional heather. But if you add nitrogen to this in increasing amounts, then the sphagnum gets displaced, and then we start to see, as I say, heather and also tree cover coming in. The picture on the right hand will have been impacted by nitrogen, but it's also been impacted by drainage. Drainage also therefore lowers at least a decomposition of the peat and a change in the biodiversity. The important thing with all of this is that many of these peatland sites are protected. There are either SSIs, SACs or SPAs. They are remnants of what used to be there, so any impacts on them increase the potential for those habitats to become degraded, and we lose the biodiversity, and we also potentially lose the water holding and water holding properties of those bogs. So very quick summary. As I increased acidity can lead to the full loss of sphagnum. A really good examples of this, but it's sort of historical. In the Pennines around Sheffield and Manchester, it's a slightly different setup, but again, sulfur and nitrogen from various industries there led to complete loss of sphagnum. Once that had happened, you ended up with bare peat surfaces, and then that peat was then lost through wind blow, and because it was drying out, it became more readily susceptible to fire and full depth fire. And when you think of a blanket bog being up to 2 meters deep, that's a lot of peat being lost and a lot of carbon being released. So you've got a biodiversity decrease there, you've got a carbon increase, and the water holding and slowing properties of peat bog are also lost. So you get an increase in flooding And then also from the peat particles, you also get a problem of water quality issues, which the water companies have to deal with. So yeah, increased nitrogen levels favour higher plants at the expense of sphagnum, and high levels of ammonia are toxic to sphagnums. So benefits for tackling atmospheric pollution, if we can, then actually bogs are actually quite resilient. If we can reduce ammonia, if we can sort out the drainage issues and various other things, a sphagnum-dominated peat bog will actually colonise relatively or recolonise relatively quickly, and then that has massive benefits to society from both the biodiversity, also recreational services that they provide, but also in flood management, water quality, carbon storage. So that, that's the benefits of tackling airborne pollution. If you want more information, then there's a lot of stuff available on the IUCN web pages, and there's a link there. And hopefully these slides will be sent out so you'll be able to access that link. So I'm now going to pass on to, if I can correctly do it, pass on to Emma. And it's now over to you, Emma.
Hello, thanks, Alistair. I'm Emma Abrams. I'm a Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer for Kent and Leven in South Cumbria. And I'm just going to talk through some of the practical solutions on farm for reducing ammonia emissions. So if we think back to Susan's slides where she highlighted the various different aspects of the farm business that ammonia can come from, and also the key ways in which to reduce ammonia emissions, being reducing the airflow, reducing the surface area of slurry. I'm just going to hopefully talk through options for farmers at all these different stages of the farm business. So it's really important that we look at ammonia emissions at every stage, because you might make some gains in the way that your housing is set up for livestock, but you could then easily lose those gains that if you spread in an inappropriate way, for example, or at an inappropriate time. And again, in the red box, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can just see an example of why it's worthwhile for the farmer as well to conserve the ammonia, because it is essentially a valuable fertiliser product that quite often is being brought into the farm. So if they can preserve as much of that in their organic manures as possible, then it's going to be a real saving on the farm as well as limiting the impacts from ammonia on public health and the environment. So the first thing we'll talk about is feeding strategies. So when we feed livestock, it's not particularly efficient at using the nitrogen in the feed. There's an excess that is excreted out, and as Stephen highlighted, when the urine and the dung mix, ammonia is produced. So if we can minimise the amount of nitrogen that's been excreted from the stock, then we lessen the ability to produce ammonia. There's been some research done that shows that a 14 to 15% crude protein diet has no detrimental effect on renewable fertility. And obviously we've heard from Andy that there are working groups looking at how to best advise farmers on this particular topic. The animal housing itself is another source of ammonia. So if we can reduce the exposed area of manure on the farm in the housing, or reduce the airflow over that area, we can reduce the amount of ammonia that's being emitted. So some practical solutions to that is to increase the amount of scraping that's done in passages, or change to a system where you're actually washing it down rather than scraping. Also the setup of the animal housing, so you can integrate certain technologies into the housing system that allows a quicker separation of urine and feces, because we know that when they mix, that is when we've got that greater potential to produce ammonia. So some of these options might be something that a farmer could implement now on his current farm, and some of them might be something that is a bit more longer term to think about if they are, for example, wanting to install some new facilities on farm. They might want to include some of these technologies to reduce ammonia emissions, and in fact it might be a requirement in the future when we look at the things that have been put forward in the clean air strategy. With permitting and regulations, it might be that new structures have to include these things. And we've got some facts at the bottom there with just how much you can decrease your ammonia emissions by if you take on some of these strategies. So manure heaps, they're not quite as risky in terms of ammonia emissions as slurry, because the carbon in the straw that's in the muck does help to lock up the nitrogen. However, they are still something that can cause ammonia emissions. And if you go and see a farm that has majority rough muck, then this might be where one of the areas they might want to address. So again, we're looking at reducing the airflow. So if we can cover the heap, add more straw to the heap to soak up that urine, make it a more stable product. If we can make the surface area smaller, even if it is exposed, or if we can store it under cover, storing it under cover obviously keeps the rainfall off as well, and allows you to stack it up and also minimise airflow over the muck. Slurry storage is a big one. It's mentioned specifically in the clean air strategy, so we know it's and we know from the graphs you showed that it's a big source of potential ammonia emissions. CSF have been speaking to farmers for years about trying to have enough storage capacity so that the slurry can be spread at the right time, obviously to try and increase or decrease the risk to runoff and its effects on water quality, but equally to reduce the effects of ammonia emissions as well. So covering the straw itself will obviously prevent airflow over the surface of the slurry and prevent ammonia emissions, but also in doing so you can keep water out and hopefully store it for longer, apply it at the right time of year in appropriate conditions that will reduce the ammonia emissions. If the slurry has a high enough fibre content, you could allow it to develop a natural crust. Again, capping it and stopping that interaction with the air. And then there's some other sorts of technologies out there that are available in pictures on the slide of these. So you've got your light expanded clay aggregates. So you just throw them over the surface of the slurry, and it prevents the airflow. Equally, the same with the texture covers. Practically on farm, we know that there's quite a lot of instances where putting a formalised cover on a slurry straw is quite a difficult thing to do, particularly if you've got a very old straw, or just a straw that was never designed to be covered over, and your system makes it very difficult for you to safely manage that slurry if you put a cover on it. We see that a lot with concrete-sided pits, for example. So it may be that these options are more suitable in those cases. Low emissions slurry storage. So as I alluded to in the previous slide, it's kind of picking the best solution for your setup, and each option has a different, is effective in a different way. But I think the point here is that if you can do something, you can still reduce your emissions quite substantially. So if we just work around these pictures, you can expect a 60% reduction if you stick a floating cover on a lagoon. 40% if you allow a natural crust to develop. 100% if you use one of these slurry bags. 80% if you stick a roof on a tin tower, for example. Next slide. So the way that you obviously think about, we've talked so far about what's coming out the back of the cow, where it ends up and how it's managed in the housing setup, how that slurry is then stored, and then now we're looking at how it's spread. So at every stage, there are solutions available to farmers for reducing their ammonia emissions. Now, as Rosa mentioned, we expect flash flakes to go, because if you think about it, the way that they spread slurry is that they encourage a lot of interaction with the air, because every droplet, the surface area of every droplet is interacting with air. So really the point here is to try and get it on the land as closely as possible, and in some cases stick it straight in the land. Now, these different techniques obviously come with different abilities to reduce ammonia emissions, but they also come with different suitabilities on different farms. So it's very much about helping your clients to understand what their options are so that they can pick the best one for their setup. So, for example, you may be more inclined to look at trailing shoe on a grassland farm than you would be injection. But at each stage, there is a saving to be had in terms of ammonia emissions. And it also matters when and what conditions you apply your slurry to the land. So applying in cool, windless and damp conditions will minimise the volatilisation of ammonia. We obviously don't want them applied on saturated or compacted soils, which again is something that CFF has been advising for years because of the water quality impact. But now the benefits are twofold because we also have, those circumstances are not ideal if we're wanting to reduce ammonia emissions as well. And obviously just keeping to the code of good agricultural practice, and then hopefully when we get more guidance, I can't remember the acronym that Andy used, but the sort of best practice for ammonia that we're hoping to see by the end of the year. Within the clean air strategy, there was a very key point that Rosie mentioned, which was to incorporate manure within 12 hours. So where that's possible, if you're sowing a crop or reseeding, it's very clear that within the first 12 hours of having spread manure on the land, that is when the vast majority of the ammonia is released. So incorporating it as quickly as possible will have the greatest benefit. And again, it's important to do it in the correct conditions. And it's also important when we talk about all these different measures to remember that is nitrogen that is being preserved for the growing of a crop to a farmer. It's definitely a double benefit. And we can have reductions of up to 90% if we can rapidly incorporate manure. And the farmer will also be getting the best out of his product. So now we're talking not about organic manures used on the farm, but about things that are being brought into the farm, fertiliser. So as I mentioned before, you can lose quite a lot of nitrogen from your urea as ammonia. Urease inhibitors provide emission reductions of up to 40% for liquid and 70% for solid urea. There's also the option of polymer-coated granules, which provide a slower release fertiliser and again reduce emissions. And then at the bottom, there's just a quick little example here to show that whilst on the surface the two products might look like they cost about the same, the volatility of the products and the potential losses are quite different, and that's definitely something to bear in mind. Particularly if you feel that it's difficult to apply your urea in the correct conditions, you're more likely to lose that nitrogen from that product than you are with these other ones. Okay, so separation of slurry and digestate. Separation in itself does not reduce emissions, but it does make it easier to manage the two products. And one thing that I've come across a lot with the farms I work with is that when we propose putting a roof on a current slurry store, the main concern is that the sort of consistency of that product once you exclude all the rainwater, and are they able to manage it safely? If they can't stir it, if they can't pump it, if they can't spread it, it's no good to them. So in future, knowing that all slurry stores are going to have a cover on, it could be an option for some people to actually get a separator and just store their liquid element under cover, which is the more volatile portion of the slurry anyway. And once it's under cover, it is easier to manage if it is just liquid. So you don't have to worry about stirring and things like that. So that's why we talk about separation in terms of ammonia emissions. And then the pH reduction of slurry. So you can reduce the pH at various different stages. You can reduce it in the housing, you can reduce it in the store itself, and as the picture at the bottom shows, you can acidify the slurry during the spreading method. When we talk about the acidification of slurry, I think we do need to bear in mind that this might not be the sort of most immediate approach that most people would take. I think some of the other solutions we've covered may well be a more feasible starting point for the farms we work with. But I just wanted to mention that. And now I'm going to move on to the role of trees in terms of managing ammonia emissions. So trees can do a few things. So we talked a lot about airflow and interacting with the surface of slurry. So first of all, you can use trees positioned upwind to lessen the flow of air, to intercept wind and to reduce the flow of air over your facilities where ammonia is being produced, whether that's a slurry store or your housing. And then equally, they can be placed downwind and they have a role in capturing ammonia as well that does come off that facility. And then also, if you have, livestock roaming around an area with trees, and they will also directly capture the ammonia coming off any density of stock that's under that setting, under those trees. And then finally, they play a role in mixing the air, which increases the dispersion. And in doing so, they're going to help protect and lessen the nitrogen deposition on local habitats. There is actually some helpful information online. The link in the slide is really good for helping to understand how and what the function of trees is with regards to ammonia capture, and also helps you kind of figure out how you might want to implement it on your farm. And we've got a few little stats. So utilising trees for Shelterbelts can reduce ammonia from housing for up to 25%, 10 to 20% on slurry lagoons, and up to 60% for livestock ranging. And obviously there's lots of other benefits to trees as well. So farm diversification, animal welfare, and associated improved productivity, carbon storage, biodiversity, flood alleviation, improving water quality, and also for mitigating when you've got a planning application in, planted trees might be a mitigation option against the proposed development. And then I'm just going to finish off with a list of some small interventions, because I appreciate that some of the ones that I've mentioned may be quite big and expensive and possibly quite a big change to the farm business. But what I want to get across to them is that I think on every single farm, something could be done as a starting point to reduce those emissions and conserve nitrogen for the business. So keeping the air velocity and temperature of air over foul surfaces as low as possible. Obviously that could be done with tree shelter belts. Keep passageways and yards clean and dry, increase scraping frequency and wash down collecting yards. Consider using legumes in place of nitrogen fertiliser in grass blades, cover crops, living mulches. Consider mob grazing to improve grazing efficiency, and in doing so, reduce the housing period of your stock, because that's where an awful lot of the emissions start from. Ensure that crude protein is targeted to animal needs in the feed. And for further guidance, there's a link on this slide, but also just generally over the next year, really keeping an eye out for how all of this is developing, how these working groups get on and what conclusions they come to, because we have known that this has been coming for a couple of years now, but I feel like now we're getting to the business end of hopefully getting some really clear direction on what is going to be required of the farms we work with. And hopefully, if we can start to talk to our farmers about some of these solutions, they'll be in a good place to implement them when we have that additional clarity. I'm going to pass on now to Rosie. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the funding opportunities for farmers to implement some of these solutions, if I can find her. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rosie.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So before I start talking about the funding, I'm going to put in a caveat that we still don't know the full details about a lot of the funding that is going to be available. So we probably have just as many questions as most of you guys do as well. But this is what we do know. So in terms of finding funding for anything that reduces ammonia emissions, the one that has just ended is a small productivity grant. Round 3 closed in November, and that was for sort of specific items funded at 40%, and it had very specific maximum and minimum spends, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. Essentially, the air quality items that were included were things like variable rate controllers for fertiliser spreaders, flow rate monitoring for slurry, and then your trailing shoe, dribble bars, slurry injectors. And there were actually portable ammonia analyzers as well, which is something that we hope in CSF we're going to get our hands on fairly soon as well. So that's what has been. What they're talking about to replace the countryside productivity scheme is the Farming Investment Fund. Now, all the details of this can be found in the Agricultural Transition Plan that's out at the moment. I think it came out at the end of November, start of December. This fund is due to start in autumn of this year. It's very much based on the countryside productivity scheme with a similar application process. But it is actually split into 2 strands. So one, the lower sort of strand, is going to be very similar to the previous productivity fund. And then there's another part which is going to have basically higher investment. We're hoping to include sort of slurry management equipment in those. So the lower tier is going to be called the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, small grants with a simple online application. And basically grants can be available towards the purchase of predetermined items with clear kind of grant value assigned to each item. So it sounds very similar to the productivity scheme. We think it's going to have very similar things within it as well, but we still don't quite know what items are going to be in there. There's also going to be something called the Farming Transformation Fund. And it's described as substantial investments in equipment, technology or infrastructure with the potential to transform the business performance. So it sounds like much bigger grants. There's going to be a 2-stage application process. So the first one is a sort of expression of interest. And then there'll be a second round, which kind of gives a scoring. They have said that some grants may be given a higher proportion of the cost if they deliver the greatest public goods. So there's very much that emphasis on the greatest public goods. So if there's something that truly reduces ammonia emissions, it probably stands a better chance. But as with all these things, we don't know the finer details yet. The other thing that definitely raised a lot of interest in the Agricultural Transition Plan was the talk of a slurry investment scheme. Now, again, we only know what was written in that Agricultural Transition Plan. But what it does say is that they're going to provide funding for new slurry stores and equipment to protect the environment in ways that exceed the current regulatory requirements. The current regulatory requirements are 4-month slurry storage unless you're in an MVZ, in which case it's 5 months. And that's for cattle slurry. Pigs, I think 6 months already. There'll be initial focus on locations where the environmental impact will be greatest. So we hope that will be linked in with current air and water quality prioritisation areas. But again, we don't quite know what the basis will be for that environmental impact. They're saying they'll only invest with stores which are sufficiently large enough to contain at least 6 months slurry production and are covered. So again, not quite sure how that's implemented, but they're obviously looking for absolute best practice. They plan to publish details of the scheme as they are formed in the second quarter of 2021. So it sounds like we'll start to hear more even in the next few months. And they expect to be making funding available from autumn 2022. Again, we don't quite know the full extent of that, whether that will be a pilot or whether there'll be more sort of coming out as we go along. But hopefully we will start to hear some more details very soon. And this is the one that CSF is very excited about, and I think a lot of farmers are excited about as well. So the capital grant scheme is also changing this time round. So for standalone capital grants, the hedgerow and boundary grants, the water capital grants, and new air quality grants are all going to be incorporated together. The total value, which has been £10,000 in previous years, is going to increase to £20,000. And that's £20,000 for each of those groups. So £20,000 for water quality, £20,000 for hedgerow, and £20,000 for air quality. So there's a potential for an applicant to apply for up to £60,000 if you're applying for all three groups. All the existing water capital options are going to continue. So things like self-supporting covers for slurry stores, they're all going to be in there still. Everything that has been a water capital option in the past is going to carry on being classed as a water option, even if it also contributes to air quality. All slurry stores now require catchment sensitive farming approval, so the approval process is still the same as it would have been before for risky water quality items. The new air quality options, all we have so far is a list of what they're going to be. So there's going to be some low emission flooring for livestock buildings. There's going to be some automatic slurry scrapers, and there's also going to be funding to plant trees as Shelterbelts, and then the protection for those trees. Now, the standalone capital grants are going to open in February. There's talk of the 9th, but we still haven't had that confirmed. And the closing date will be the end of April. Now, that's quite important because anyone who wants a water quality grant, that closing date is going to be much sooner than it has been in previous years. You will still need catchment sensitive farming support for any of those risky items. And we would say get in touch with us as soon as possible because we are struggling with capacity to approve all of the applicants that we're getting in at the moment. So leading on from that, the mid-tier applications are going to be very similar to last year. They're hopefully going to open in February, the same day as the other ones, but the closing date should be the end of July, we think. So similar to last year, application forms and approval, you need to get in touch with us by the end of May. But again, the sooner that people get in touch with us about a mid-tier agreement, the more opportunity we'll have to actually be able to approve it. We are actually talking about finding some sort of prioritisation for approving applications this year because we struggled so much to get through the volume of applicants last year. So the sooner you get in touch and the better the environmental benefit, the more chance people have got of getting an approval. The additional options that are in those capital options are also going to be available in a mid-tier. There will be a cap on capital items in mid-tier this year. It has been mentioned that the cap on capital items will be 150,000. I think I've read somewhere recently that that's broken down into those air quality, water quality, and hedgerow and boundary again. And I think there's some slight differences. But as that becomes published, we will definitely let you know. Talk to your catchment sensitive farming officer who will let you know as soon as we find out. The important part of this is that the standalone grants that were previously on the same application forms as mid-tiers are now going to be on a different application form and are going to have those earlier closing dates. For the first time ever, we know that countryside stewardship is actually going to be open and that it is continuing, and it is continuing until 2023. So you have got a couple of years left to actually apply for this. And it's the first time we've actually had some guarantee that it's still going to be there. Targeting for water quality and the air quality, which follows the same targeting areas as water at the moment, is going to stay the same, the high priority areas for 2021. However, this is all under review. and it will be revised at some point to include sort of new priorities as the next phase of catchment sensitive farming carries on. But we just haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. So I think it'll probably be next year before we can actually change those priorities. However, in Cumbria especially, that's not going to make much difference because most of Cumbria is currently covered by high priority areas. I know there are certainly areas that are only medium priority at the moment. So I think that's all we know at the moment in terms of countryside stewardship and funding. I imagine everyone will have quite a few questions about that. I know that within catchment sensitive farming, we still have quite a lot of questions too, but we'll try and answer everything we can. Okay, I'm going to hand this all back to Colette, if I can find her on my screen, and she's going to take questions.
Can you hear me, Rosie?
Yes.
Can you hand back to Jamie, because I seem to have lost connection with the WebEx, so I can't.
Oh, Jamie's got it anyway. Brilliant.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so we'll open up for questions. Is that okay, Jamie? I had a look at the chat before it all disappeared. It seemed there were a lot of comments about the urea consultation. I can't actually see what the comments are at the moment. I know there was a question about what approach the devolved administrations were taking as compared to Defra in England. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if Jonathan Skidmore has got an answer for that.
No, Colette. I mean, the urea consultation is still open, I think, isn't it, for another
26th of January it closes.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about urea all day, but worth reading the consultation and the pros and cons of the different options.
CSF has responded with Natural England, but our approach has been just to evaluate the pros and cons of each option, so we have not specified a preference. There was a question about AdBlue in lorries, and I seem to recollect that was one of the questions that came up in the consultation. So we'll have another look at that, and we'll add it into the Q&A. But as Jonathan said, it's worth having a look at the consultation document because it is quite comprehensive, and you still have got an opportunity to respond to it. It's still live, and it's open till the 26th of January. There was a question about
to address the question on AdBlue, Colette. My understanding, AdBlue is a urea-based product, and it was all to do with when there's Euro 4 and Euro 5 and Euro 6 compliance came in to tackle the nitrogen oxide, so the nitrogen dioxide and nitrogen oxide, otherwise known as NOx, in diesel exhausts. My understanding, I don't fully understand the chemistry, is that the urea is sprayed into the catalytic converter and it reacts with the nitrogen, the nitrogen oxides, but the end product is actually N2, which is the molecule for nitrogen. So it's reasonably unreactive and water vapor. So unless the systems are slightly inefficient, I don't know, I don't think any urea actually comes out the end of the exhaust, is my understanding. So I don't think it's a big issue, but I could be wrong.
Okay. And there was a question about mitigating high background levels of ammonia in areas such as Eden. There was a project, the Nitrogen Futures project, which is completed and reported. It was undertaken by JNCC, and they looked at the issue of applying national measures. What effect would these national measures that are proposed under the Clean Air Strategy and that we've been discussing, such as the permitting, the covering of slurry stores, and the banning of splash plates, and would these be enough to bring down background levels sufficiently? And the conclusion was that we're likely to meet the 16% target under the Clean Air Strategy if these, measures are all implemented, but that it wouldn't necessarily be enough to reduce the impact on sensitive designated sites. So, in those areas, there may be some more localised targeting required. And, we'll cover more of that on Monday's session, with regard to the planning system and how that's being addressed. There was one other question. Well, I don't think it was a question. It was a comment, I think, from Michael Graham. It was regarding the use of straw and lecker balls and the hexa covers on slurry stores, and the suitability in high rainfall areas. And we know that there are slurry stores out there that are odd shapes, and they may not be suitable for applying a floating cover on, for example. In those instances, these sort of options with the lecker balls and the hexa covers and straw, because they're much more flexible, they can be used to reduce the ammonia emissions, but obviously, a roof over the top would be necessary to keep rain out, if you're in a high rainfall area and with limited capacity. So I think those were all the comments that in the chat and the questions that I saw before my system disappeared. Are there any questions from participants? Anything you'd like to ask?
Colette, it's Jamie. There's just a couple more which are just around schemes. So I'll just read those two out. A few comments, but these were the questions. So can I just check that you're saying that capital-only items are now separate to mid-tier?
Hi, Colette. I can take this one. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, yes, we are saying that capital-only applications are separate to mid-tier. Obviously, if you're going for a mid-tier application, you can still include capital items. But if you're just going for a capital-only application, it's separate to mid-tier, and it has a separate closing date, which is earlier.
Thank you, Rosie. And then the other one was, will farmers with a live mid-tier agreement be able to apply for ammonia grant items?
So they will be, it'll probably, and I'm saying probably because we haven't got the full details yet, follow the same kind of principles as in the past, that if there's a parcel without a mid-tier on it currently, then yes, you would be able to apply for another agreement on that parcel. So potentially, a bit like anything in the past, if you've got a mid-tier agreement that's just on a few fields, then you'll be able to apply for a separate standalone grant in the yard. But if your yard is already under a live agreement, you probably won't be able to apply for a separate standalone agreement on that parcel. We haven't had that confirmed, but we're pretty certain that's how it'll play out.
Thanks, Rosie.
And Michael has actually sent me a message to say what those caps in mid-tier are going to be. So for water capital items, it's going to be 120,000. For hedgerows and boundaries, it's going to be 50,000. And for air quality items, it's going to be 120,000. So that's within a mid-tier application. That's what the caps are going to be within a mid-tier application from now on.
Thanks, Rosie. That was it in terms of questions. Like I said, there's a few comments which we'll take away, but that's it for questions. Thanks, Colette.
Okay. Anybody else want to ask any questions?
We've got a couple more come in. Which is the first one, which is, will CSFO's Catchment Sensitive Farming officers be attending sites this year or all virtual?
I can try and answer that again. At the moment, we're not supposed to be visiting sites, obviously just because of the current lockdowns. We don't know what the future holds, whether those restrictions are going to be lifted or not. We're obviously all hoping to get out, but we do have that virtual kind of protocol to follow if we have to. I think everyone agrees that the real site visits are far more valuable, but we'll do what we can and we'll just see how the situation evolves.
Thanks, Rosie. And I think it just a helpful reminder that it is really crucial to engage with your local catchment sensitive farming officer early, just in case it does go down that train. None of us know what's going to happen in the future. So the earlier the engagement, the easier things will be. The next question was, how do slatted floor buildings compare for reducing ammonia? How do slatted floor buildings compare for reducing ammonia emissions? Jonathan or Colette, did you want to take that?
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. So the objective of a slatted floor from an air quality point of view is to reduce that surface area, so that effectively that emitting area, that surface area which interacts with the atmosphere, which can give rise to high levels of ammonia. So a slatted floor could either be a tank beneath a slatted floor, so effectively fluid stores beneath the building, which we see in some instances, particularly on sort of the pig side of things. But the items which are going to be included in the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, the low emission floorings, effectively a grooved channel in your floor, and that's to rapidly accelerate away the sort of the urine component of the faeces. And again, that will reduce that surface area and reduce that interaction between the faeces and the urine and reduce the ammonia emissions. I'm aware Nigel Pellington's on this call. He's probably muted actually, and he's certainly got a lot more expertise in this area, but I think what I've outlined is the general principle of it.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I think the other thing is, with slatted buildings, you can get these plastic non-return flaps which help to keep the ammonia. Once the feces and the urine have gone through, it stops the ammonia from coming back up through the slatted floor, and they can be retrofitted as well to slatted floors.
Yes, it's stopping that interaction between the atmosphere and the slurry itself, just trying to keep it out the way in a closed environment.
Thanks for that.
Any more?
There's one which I'm not sure it's a question that we're able to answer. It might be something for Defra, the policy holders for it. So it's concerning that existing material agreement holders may not be able to have these new items. Should this not be addressed?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
That's okay. It was just a concern that existing material agreement holders may not be able to have these new items, and should it not be addressed? Again, I did say it's probably one for Defra as the policy holders.
Yeah, are we talking about in the farming investment fund?
Hi, Colette. I think it's saying within a mid-tier.
Like a parcel, yeah.
If a parcel is
okay.
already tied up, and I think that is one of the horrors of countryside stewardship. I think we're all aware that it's not a perfect system. I think we completely agree with you. And it doesn't seem to be anything we're having any influence on. Obviously, the more people who mention that to Defra and the RPA, the better, potentially. We'll see what comes out. The handbook hasn't come out yet. It may be that something changes, but personally, I don't have very high hopes, unfortunately. We'll see what happens. Hopefully things will change over time.
It's something, we can raise with Defra in the air quality project management group, so we'll add it to the list.
Thanks both. And then, Rosie, do you mind if I just direct this one to you, which is just about the April, I think you've already covered it, but it was just about the April deadline seeming quite tight, especially if agents and CSFOs can't attend site due to COVID. What's the reasoning for this?
I agree. It's horrifically tight. we don't know the reasoning for it. We still haven't actually had the dates confirmed. These are dates that have been suggested. We have argued that they're maybe not the most suitable dates. We don't know the reasoning, but CSF is quite concerned about the tight turnaround for this as well.
Thanks, Rosie. I think that's it in terms of questions, Colette. Thanks for those.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Just to let you know that the recording of this event will be posted on YouTube, so we'll send you the link. We'll also be circulating a survey which we'd love you to complete, what you liked, what you didn't like about this event, and what you think could be done to improve it, if anything was missing that you wanted to know about. And we'll also be circulating some notes to accompany the two webinars, so you'll have a reference document for future use. And we have applied basis points for these events, and so that's in progress, and we'll let you know what the update is on that. So I just need to provide them with some extra information today. And we're hoping that you'll join us on Monday, on the 18th at 2 o'clock. So we're going to cover an overview of the planning system and impact risk zones, APIS, and undertaking a scale assessment. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And it's still not too late to register. You can join by clicking on the link in the email that we sent you and register. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Colette. Thank you, everyone. We'll end the recording then.
Thank you.